Analyzing authors. Why is it important to know about the author? When we pick up a book, most of us don't really take the time to research the author. However, we learn that sometimes researching an author can help us better understand what we are reading. Most importantly, knowing more about an author helps us be better critical thinker. Most authors write about things that are important to them and they want to get a message out and they have a purpose. As readers, we need to figure out their intentions. In this presentation, we will be looking at 5 components about authors: the author's credential, bias, stance, intended audience, and purpose. These components will help us be better critical thinkers. The first component is the author's credential. When we talk about the author's credential, we are referring to the author's educational background, work experience, community involvement, and hobbies. We are seeking to validate if the author knows what he or she is writing about. Are they credible? For example, someone that went to school to become a geologist is credible when they are talking about earthquakes. However, someone that went to school for geology would not be credible to talk about the weather. So when we look at an author's credential, we are trying to evaluate if the author knows what he or she is talking about. The second component we look at is the author's bias. When someone is biased, they are one-sided about an issue. We can tell if an author is biased. How can we tell if an author is biased? Well, we look at the type of language they use. We look at specific words they use to describe the situation. The language then gives us a clue about the type of tone the author is using. As readers, we can't hear authors speak directly to us, so therefore we need to guess or infer what tone we think the author is using. Now, I included a tone sheet as a resource for you to use because many times we tend to use basic tones like happy, sad, or mad. The tone sheet I provided will give you more tones you can use to articulate your thought more clearly. So let's go ahead and look at an example of how 2 writers reacted to Michelle Williams' Golden Globes acceptance speech. She says, "To choose when to have my children and with whom, when I felt supported and able to balance our lives, knowing as all mothers know that the scales must and will tip toward our children." Now, one response to Michelle Williams' Golden Globe speech, says Michelle Williams used her Golden Globe speech to celebrate a woman's right to choose. And then the other response states, while the other, no, Michelle Williams, women don't need to kill their kids to get ahead. Both authors are biased. How do we know? Well, first, notice the first author uses the word celebrate and the second author uses to kill. So both authors are biased in their own ways, and the language they use show us that they are biased. The third component is the author's stance. The stance is the position the author takes on a particular issue. An author may be biased, but what stance do they take? The author's stance can be against it or for it. They can even be neutral. The fourth component is to identify the author's intended audience. Whenever an author writes something, they have specific people they have in mind they know will read their writing. The intended audience can be young people, older people, professionals such as educators, doctors, or scientists. Sometimes the writing is for the general public, meaning it's for anyone. So be careful not to select general public all the time though. While it can be true, there are always specific people the author is targeting. Sometimes the intended audience can be specific groups like people who enjoy dancing, skateboarding, people who enjoy riding bikes. Sometimes the writing is specifically for people who enjoy horseback riding, and the list can go on. When trying to figure out the intended audience, look at the vocabulary the author uses, and then consider the writing style also. Does the author use complex sentences? If so, they are probably writing to professionals. If the author uses simple sentences, then they are probably writing to the general public. Let's look at this first example. Pause and take a moment to read this passage. Who do you think is the intended audience? Who does the author have in mind as they are writing this? Well, based on some of these terms, we can infer or guess that the intended audience are probably doctors and scientists due to the complex vocabulary used. Let's look at another example. Pause and take a moment to read this paragraph. Who do you think is the intended audience? This paragraph does not use complex vocabulary like the previous example. However, it does use special vocabulary. So we can say the intended audience are fishermen. How do we know this? Because the term jig. A jig is a type of bait fishermen use to catch fish. But of course, you wouldn't know that if you didn't fish. The last component is to identify the author's purpose. Authors typically have three purposes when they write. They are to inform, persuade, and entertain. So when an author is informing, they are simply just giving you information, and they are usually neutral. To persuade is to convince you to do something or to agree with them on a particular issue. Finally, to entertain is invoking humor or pleasure about a topic. One tip to remember is that sometimes authors can use more than one purpose in their writing. So for an example, an author can inform and persuade. The author can also persuade and entertain. So it doesn't always have to be only one purpose, but a combination of purposes. So let's look at this first example. Pause and take a moment to read this example. Tofu is a healthy protein supplement. It is low cost and provides many nutritional benefits. Everyone should eat tofu. What is the author's purpose? Well, the author's purpose is to persuade and inform. So how do we know this? Well, if we look at the last sentence, it uses the word should. This means they want you to eat tofu. So if we were to look at this, the author is both persuading you and the author also informs you about tofu. Let's look at the second example. What do you think is the author's purpose? It says sharks are endangered species. There are many types of sharks. Some can be aggressive while others can be gentle. The author's purpose is to simply inform you about sharks. We know this because the tone is neutral. The author does not use words that show us the author is biased. So that gives us a hint that they're simply just giving us information. Now let's look at this last example. The United States is loved by many countries. We take over people's countries and try to make them have the same values as us. We kill their leaders and put our own leaders in charge. What do you think is the author's purpose? In this presentation, I showed you all the ways we analyze authors and how these analyses help us have a greater understanding of a piece of text we read or the intent of the text. You will need to use these skills when you write your final critical paper at the end of the semester. You will need to analyze the author of the article you are critiquing in your paper. You will need to be sure you include all these components in your paper.